Okay, welcome everybody to day 2 of the CityDAO Academic Conference. This is our afternoon session, and we are very pleased to begin with a distinguished panel to discuss the topic of K-12 Web3 education. So I'd like to introduce our panelists and give each person a moment to please introduce themselves. We'll start with Johnny from DAO Academy.
Hey, thanks for having me here. I'm Johnny. Everybody calls me Johnny Ringo, and I've been working with a few different DAOs for the past couple of years, mostly in community building and really getting strong into the education aspect of it, trying to bridge that gap between what builders are building and what the community is actually using from a user standpoint. So that's what I'm here for.
Great, welcome. Next, we have Mike Peck.
Hi there.
Is that Brady?
Hi, how you doing? It is, yes. She was just
Okay.
able to join us. So
we have Mike Peck and Vridi from Ed3. Mike, please, first.
sure. Yeah, no, thanks again for having us. My name is Mike Peck. So I've been in the public school system, never really left. After graduating, went into college and then went on to work in a public school where I've been for the last 15 years. Was in the classroom for about 7 of those years and now lead a technology department at a public school district in Pennsylvania. Relevant to Web3, spent some time in the space going back to the last bull market and then really never left. Got more involved in DAOs, contributing to a couple of them along the way, and then working with Vridi and our other co-founder, Michael, to found Ed3 DAO, where we're working on bringing education into the public school system. I'll let Vridi introduce herself and tell you a little more too.
Thanks, welcome,
Hi,
Mike.
everyone. Thanks so much for having us. I apologize about my attire, the hat. It's Labor Day weekend, so we're at a lake. So I'm Vridi Saroff. I'm an educator, first and foremost. I've spent time as a teacher through Teach for America and as a dean. And then I train deans across charter schools. And then we help scale those charter schools from 2 to 15 in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And then I spent 2.5 years traveling around the world building schools and building the infrastructure for professional development for educators and also training school principals on how to build really great schools. And then last year I started a company called K20 Educators, which is an organization that's helping build metaverse spaces and environments for learning communities, specifically educators. And I co-founded Ed3 DAO with Mike in an effort to educate educators about Web3.
Thank you, Vridi, and welcome. And we have Ruben from the Digital Currency Initiative.
Hey, everybody. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me. My name is Ruben. I'm just now realizing I should be regretting the fact that I don't have a cool nickname like Johnny Ringo. But I have worked for a long time at the intersection of blockchain and education. A big chunk of that has been mostly at the university level. I work with a lot of students with my role at MIT. And then I also run a blockchain education initiative over at Stanford Law School. But maybe more relevant for this panel, I lead some research at CoinDesk on the university's team. And a big chunk of that is trying to figure out how to get more high school age students into blockchain. How do we present that to them? How do we funnel them into those kinds of programs at the university level? So that's kind of the professional side. Anecdotally, I have a couple of nephews that have heard way too much about blockchain, and they're much younger, and I'm sure they're sad about that. But yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Welcome. And we have the moderator for today's panel is Sarah from both CityDAO and Be Humane DAO.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah from Croatia. And I founded Be Humane based on my master's thesis on socially and emotionally intelligent usage of technology. And we are building a safe metaverse for kids to develop soft skills. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, everybody. And so we're just going to have kind of an open panel discussion about the use of Web3 and K-12 and the future of this kind of education. The first question is, in some ways, how do we protect children from technology that could actually potentially be dangerous in terms of, we've all seen in the crypto market how volatile things are. Is it a good idea that kids should be exposed to technology? Is it in any way being comfortable around guns, that they don't understand the consequences of what they might be able to create? Before we get into the future of education, is this something that educators should think about, that these are dangerous technologies, potentially? And I'll turn it over to Sarah to please best moderate, lead.
Yeah, Johnny?
It's funny, the terminology you use, looking at this technology like a weapon. A guy who I consider my mentor in this space, that was one of his opening lines to me, was that this new technology, it's amazing and it will help a lot of people, but so did the musket. So it does definitely have to be taken with a grain of salt that this is brand new. People don't fully understand what the causality of this is going to be to the world. We're talking about rebuilding ecosystems from the ground up. Decentralization, if it spreads like we want it to, it could redo everything. So it definitely has to be taken with a bit of en garde of this. This could be devastating if we don't take it in the right direction. And recently events with market changes, DAOs, rug pulls even, it's a good indicator that right now we really need to be looking to our leadership to try and guide us through this period. Because even decentralization still has an original source that it comes from, an idea. And we have to keep that idea pure as we move forward. And we have to, educate, because if we don't, then people are going to kind of take it and run with it. And we're going to see rug pulls and we're going to see things happen that we don't want to in this area. So, yeah, I definitely think that it should be looked at like a weapon where, I was taught to, hold a pistol at a very young age. And I'm not saying that everybody should do that, but I am saying that if you expect this to affect the next generation, like we hope it does, that we should teach them as early as possible how to handle it.
I think Johnny Ringo brought up a really interesting point. So there's kind of two flip sides here that I find really fascinating. There's this idea that to some extent, like all technology, maybe I'll don't want to make that strong statement, but there is an argument for protecting children from technology, especially this immutable worldwide technology. I think about myself, and I'm very glad that I didn't grow up in the age where now potentially some tweets that I made 5 or 10 years ago could cost me a job or a college admission or something like that, because I was pretty dumb when I was 12, 13, 14, and older. But there's a flip side, which is maybe there's some amount of protecting this technology from children that we need to do. And I think that's something that maybe Johnny was intimating a little bit. So something that I worry about is if we go in and we're teaching children who are too young about something like blockchain, what is it that they're going to picture? So right now, I think we're all maybe a certain generation, we think about blockchain in a certain way, and we have values like decentralization, and we have values like equity and openness and transparency. But if we do this wrong, the next generation, if they don't have the context around blockchain and why it's important, maybe they think of it as a purely financial tool for their own financial gain or something like that. And that could do a lot to warp not only what blockchain becomes, but how it interacts with the world, and it could hamstring its ability to really do good.
Yeah, I would second that. And the way that I like to think about it is, the reason why Web3 is different than, like, let's say guns, is because of the value that it actually provides if it's used for good. And the things that people would be missing out on, kids would be missing out on if they didn't engage in it in a positive way. And that's obviously very different than guns, because if you never touched a gun in your life, it wouldn't make a difference, right? But with Web3, there's such a huge deficit if you're not engaging with it, or just the internet in general. And so it's really about how do we how do we ensure that there's more good actors than bad actors? How do we ensure that there's parameters and infrastructure and frameworks that we're setting up so that people can engage with this technology in a way that's like conducive and regenerative to the world? And how do we, the thing that, is most exciting for me about Web3 is not only the tech, but it's about the principles and the ethos behind it. So how are we actually teaching kids about, the regenerative side of it, the immersive side of it, the, global and community side of it, the game theory side of it, and in my mind, like blockchain is just another technology practicalize those principles. And in my opinion, I don't think blockchain is going to be the last decentralized technology to emerge to do the things that we can do right now. And I think there's going to be another version of it eventually. So it's really about like, how do we teach kids the ethos and the principles behind it, and then let them, adopt technologies that can sort of like serve those well.
Kind of a side question. I don't want to pull us on a tangent, but do you have a couple second spiel on when you think about what decentralized technology might look like in the future, or like kind of what is that new version maybe look like? Or maybe you haven't thought about it. I don't want to put you on the spot, but that got me curious.
No, I mean, I'm not, and the way that I think about this is like, if we think about the evolution of decentralization, like the concept of decentralization isn't new, right? So we've had co-ops, we've had communes, we've had unbundled learning to some extent, and all of these sort of like systems have existed for a long time, but they haven't been really successful because there haven't been enough frameworks around it. And technological systems are up in the past and handled way. Chain is sort of like the further iteration of that. And if you think about like networks like Ceramic, or if you think about other networks that are like actually not using blockchain to decentralize data storage, like there's just going to be more versions of that, I think.
Thanks.
I wanted to comment on, so I think, and I would sort of align my answer most with Vreedy's in that there's actually already analogs to this that we can draw back to as far as like what happens, with technologies when they get into the hands of kids. We already are seeing the repercussions of what happens when we don't teach about responsible use of technology to kids in the form of social media. Being in a school, we're now playing catch up, and we're trying to teach kids how to responsibly use technology when for years we did not. And what you see in, some of the challenges that we see in our public schools and even beyond is a result of the use of technology by kids and even adults who they don't really have a concept of how to responsibly use it. And so they teach their kids, how they use technology. And so you end up getting like, the Facebook warriors who become challenges for our, school leadership and school administrators, because parents, act a certain way in the internet and the kids see that and think it's okay. So we saw it with Web 2 that if we kind of stay on the sidelines of teaching this technology in schools, what can happen? And so I would think that it's really important at this juncture, now seeing kind of the emergence of this next iteration of the web, that we consider very strongly, how do we bring these things into school in a responsible way, but also with some urgency too as well, because what we see now as kind of this emergent thing with Web3 is going to just become the internet in a matter of 5 to 10 years. And if we say 10 years, it's more likely going to be 3 to 5 years, just because of the way things move exponentially in the web. And so I think it's very important that we get these tools in the hands of kids. And that's going to require a really substantial lift on a lot of people's parts, mostly because we don't have the bandwidth of people who are working in schools and understand the technology, but also because we have really misaligned incentives at the public education level, particularly in the US, where focus is largely on test scores still and things of that nature. So I think it's really, really important that we start to move this technology into schools in a responsible way, not leaving it to the devices of our parents and kids at home who are already participating in the space, but may not fully understand the power that it holds.
Mike, I've always. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, sir.
It's okay. You can ask.
I just had maybe a quick follow up for Mike, because you're saying something really interesting, and I think you have maybe some good insights here. But do you have a sense of what the root is of irresponsible technology use? Because I agree with you that is happening, and it's a huge problem. But is it because we're teaching it wrong, or we're teaching it too early, or is it that we're just in trouble, and humans are just kind of constitutionally incapable of wielding technology in a safe way?
Yeah, it's tough to identify a root cause. I would say that largely schools have stayed out of it. Now, I started in education right around the time where social media was starting to emerge. So, like 2009 was like my first year teaching. So, I mean, I kind of taught all the way through the emergence of social media, and then really the mass adoption of it. And I think what happened, this is just my opinion, but schools stay out of it. There wasn't a lot of thought as to what the power of this could be, and corporations understood human behavior well enough to build these platforms in a way that people adopted them very quickly and used them to the way that these social media platforms wanted them to use it. And so what you had happen is really economics and corporate incentives and alignment and interests and values really became the way that we used a lot of this, at least initially. And so you end up getting kind of just the adoption based upon usage that was predetermined by those who were building it. So that's just my take. But I think a lot of what we see today is a result of schools standing on the sidelines, not really understanding how this was going to play a part in their school systems until now.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that the fact that Generation Z is the first digitally native generation. So, to Mike's point, we had parents that didn't know how to handle that education, and now we're having the entire system that doesn't know what to do about it. And it was interesting in the context of the research that I did. One of the students said that he compared technology to driving a car, but you go to school to learn how to drive a car, and you're getting taught by adults, while with technology you're just released onto it. You don't have any guidance, any instruction as to how to do it in a healthy manner. So I think that we now are creating that space and conversation about what are the healthier usage of technology. And there's one big NGO here in New York, at All Tech is Human, that is drawing a larger pipeline to conversations about responsible technology usage, because so far we have only had developers and technical people building the tech. Now we have actually psychologists who are also involved, social workers and educators. And to that point, I actually wanted to ask Britti and Mike, do you have any examples in CityDAO of what kind of instructions are you giving to your educators, and how are they teaching the students about Web3 and in general about technology?
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. And I was actually going to add that one of the reasons, I think one of the root causes why tech is often misused is because it's so vast what you can do with it. There's so many things. Like if you're thinking about driving a car, there's really a few things that you can do to drive a car. But with technology, there's so many opportunities, so many possibilities for how you could use it and for what it could actually provide. Like it actually powers so many other things. And so I think it's actually impossible to teach a kid to interface with every part of the internet, right? And to teach them how to be, ethical, in social media versus being ethical when you're on a community chat versus when you're ethical on, how you build apps and things like that. So I think it's actually it's not a very, I think, efficient or possible activity to actually teach a kid how to use every part of the internet ethically. So I think it's more about how do you instill ethics in kids, right? So it's like no matter what they're interfacing with, they're actually able to, do the right thing, make the right decision, use critical thinking to sort of like do that. And so that's actually how we have built our credentials that are teaching Web3 to educators so that they can teach it to students. We're definitely teaching educators about what Web3 is, what blockchain is, how NFTs work, all that. But undergirding everything that we talk about are the ethos and the principles of it. So we talk about, like, for example, metaverse course that we have, we talk about immersive learning. We talk about why immersive learning is so important. We talk about why immersive experiences are important, why enhanced experiences are important, how to engage with people virtually, what value does the metaverse bring? And then we also like give them experiences in the metaverse. When we talk about DeFi, we don't just teach them about, how the decentralized finance system work. We teach them financial literacy. We teach them about tokenomics. We teach them about game theory. We teach them about, all these sort of undergirding, principles so that if DeFi transforms into something else, they can still make decisions and use critical thinking to apply tokenomics and game theory and the literacy of the finance system to be able to sort of evolve with the system. So we're really like trying to find like what are those like principal proficiencies that can be like evergreen lifetime proficiencies that can continue even course with this technology. So that's sort of how we're thinking about it and how we talk about it with educators.
Can we turn to a question that Mike just asked, which was how do we create sandboxes where young learners can explore this tech in a responsible way? And if I could just give an example, the last two semesters, I started a trading club for the students where I was trying to teach them how to read charts. And within a very short time, some student was like, well, this isn't fun unless we're using real money. And everybody was like, yeah, we should use real money. And then some kid was like, have you seen the chart for this thing? And then the other kids were like, I think I could spare like $200. And I had to shut it down immediately. They were about to throw all of their available money at things they didn't, but it just spun out of control because it wasn't a sandbox. And it's so easy, I feel like, with any of this technology to go from let's study tokenomics to let's buy the newest altcoin we saw.
My question is, with building a sandbox, like when I think about the overall structure and idealism of Web3, and I think of a sandbox, how would you integrate those two ideas together? Because even the public school system now, it's centralized. You go to a building, you all together in a room and learn the same thing without any input on what you're learning. So how do we, and I'm not saying that I wouldn't have ideas how to, but how would we create that sandbox environment without basically butchering the concept of, Web3 and decentralization? And that is kind of the duality of the problem that we're faced with, is that the whole concept of decentralization is that you have all these outward sources of information and input, and you have to bring those together, not in a centralized way, but they have to mesh. They have to come together at some intersection. So I'd love to hear everybody's thoughts on how that could be sandboxed into something contained, but that still has that Web3 root in it,
Go ahead, Ruben.
Go ahead, Mike. No, I've talked, please.
Well, just really quick, I think that's a really good point, Johnny. Like it's like antithetical, to put kids in a sandbox and say, here you go, here's Web3. Like it doesn't really align with the values. I think just a quick example. So one of the things that, like, a very simple pedagogical strategy that most teachers will use at some point is the I do, we do, you do strategy, where it's like a gradual release, and you can get far more nuanced than that. But if we think of it as sort of like this gradual release where we work together to understand the concept, we practice it in a way that doesn't require you to necessarily, actually engage, or possibly, we're walking through the concept of like buying an NFT together, and then we send you on your way to kind of practice. Now, the part that I always struggle with is that teachers release kids to do homework, and the homework is the hardest part, and kids don't always have the same supports at home. So like, let's make sure that we're doing the modeling and the practice together. But I think that strategy is one way that we can kind of create like a sandbox, in a sense, where we have a really set piece of, or a set an important set of strategies that we can use to go from zero to, actually participating on their own. And I think one of the nice parts is that most blockchains incorporate some kind of test nets that can be used, without any kind of, real life implications.
Yeah, and I can add a slightly different perspective to that. I don't think there's any like one way to do it. I think there's a lot of experimentation that needs to happen. There's a school of thought about introducing concepts to students in a way that allows them to build upon those concepts and create the concepts from ground up. So there's this math teacher called Dan Myers. I don't know if anyone has heard of him. He, started seeing these like math problems where kids were asked to figure out like what the slope was or what the volume of something was or whatever, and he just thought that was such a bad way to teach a child about volume or slope, because it only taught them how to like learn the algorithm and learn like formulas. And so what he started doing was he started like bringing jugs of water into his classroom, and it was like, how long do you think it's going to take to fill this jug of water? And so the kids were like, okay, well, how fast is the water flowing? Well, how big is the water tank? What if we change like, the rate of the water, then how fast will it flow? And all these kind of questions. And so they started asking more questions about how to solve the problem, which actually helped them solve the problem. And I give that example because I think the sandbox should operate the same way. We should present a variable to students and we should say, okay, so this is what decentralization is trying to accomplish. This is potentially the outcome, or this is what a blockchain is trying to accomplish. So what questions do you have to try to figure out how to create an environment in a sandbox that could allow you to solve some of these problems and actually create a model that, emulates this sort of like decentralized model, and sort of like allow kids to like create that sort of space on their own. And then even set the parameters to be like, listen, right now, because we are in a school underage environment, you're not going to be able to use real currency, but like, how can we simulate that same experience in a way that is exciting for you, in a way that like, you feel really sort of like motivated by? And so, kids might say, well, what if we actually gifted like, fake tokens to each other? And, every time somebody got a fake token, it equated to like, being able to play in recess a little bit longer, whatever, consequences they wanted. And so I think like allowing students to set those parameters and create the rules and the framework of the sandbox itself, I think will invest them more in being able to do those things without having like, quote, real stakes, but then still have like enough real value in their setting and in their context to make it valuable.
Interesting. I would like to ask more about the incentives with tokens. Like, what are your opinions about incentivizing students to do certain behaviors with tokens in the education system?
Anyone? Me? Anyone?
Sarah, can you rephrase that one more time?
Yeah, so the question is about incentivizing students via tokens. So we know that children love different type of incentives, and we wanted to explore so with the crypto credentials and then what will go on blockchain, what would stay off chain. So would like to hear your opinion about that.
I think if you were to look at a school, like just the concept you're talking about, if you were to look at a school more like a DAO, and have it run a lot more like one, then you could have a token that has no money backing. You could even do it on testnet and use it as basically like a point system. Like I remember when I was a kid in kindergarten, they would give you gold stars on a little chart. if you, completed a task or, did really good on a grade or something. So you could totally flip that into a DAO. Give everybody a little more say because, oh, hey, you earned, this token. You can use that token to vote on what we're going to have for lunch on Friday because everybody loves Friday lunches, and even little things like that. That's going to help bridge the gap, especially for children, is not overcomplicating it. It's just giving them something simple and being like, here, you earned your gold star because you did your homework and got a good grade. Here's your token. Go spend it how you will as a voting right on, Friday's lunch, or, maybe everybody gets to vote on an extra week off for summer or a field trip. And that would give kids an incentive system that is completely separate from money, allow them to have a say in what they're doing, but still allow for that leadership aspect for the teachers to give them the direction of, here's the choices. We know that, these 10 things are good choices for these children to choose from. So let's give them the choice. And I don't want to call it an illusion of choice because it's not. The kid still gets to choose among those things. Oh, hey, this is what I want to vote for. But there's still that little bit of leadership there from the adults, from the people who care that this is going in the right direction. And I think that is a way that could be melded together, where you could take this voting incentive mechanism and earning like grades and whatnot and put it towards the child being able to like feel that incentive.
I think one of the underlying concepts here is the concept of extrinsic motivation versus intrinsic motivation. And most teachers and most schools have relied on extrinsic motivation because it's the easier thing to do to motivate a child to, quote, behave or do the things that they want them to do. And this is like persistent across all schools, all countries, the entire world. Even parents use extrinsic motivators quite a bit. And I don't think there's anything necessarily terrible about it, but I think that there are arguments to be made about how, if you're constantly motivating a kid by stars or by rewards or by external factors, then they will never develop that sort of internal scope to be able to, do the right thing when they should do it. And that's really, really hard to do. I was a teacher and it was really hard to build that intrinsic motivation in kids. And so I think starting off with extrinsic motivators in the way that Johnny Ringo just described it, I think is actually a really good activity to do. But you want to wean kids off of those extrinsic motivators, and you actually want to instill those values in them so that they become more intrinsically motivated to do those things. And usually you get more motivated by understanding the underlying reason behind things and underlying benefits that a kid would get even if they didn't get that external reward. And so that sort of that's the gradual sort of release into intrinsic motivation is really, really, really hard to do. But that's sort of I think the goal of where schools want to head. But there haven't been very good teacher development systems or professional development that teaches teachers how to do that. And I think DAOs and Web3 are going to experience a similar thing where I think we're going to go almost into a pendulum where most people join DAOs because they're really motivated by the mission and the values of it. And then eventually, once they spend a lot of time on it, they're like, wait a minute, I should start getting paid for my work. And then they need those extrinsic value motivators. But then eventually they're not going to we're not going to be able to pay them enough to stay unless they're back in the middle where they're both intrinsically motivated and extrinsically motivated. And I think that's sort of the equilibrium that we need to strike with kids too, but it's super hard to do. And there's all these sort of schools of thoughts on and professional development on how to actually make that happen. But yeah, it's hard to do.
I like the point you bring up there about the transition. And, as a dad, I should be thinking more that way myself, because I have that conversation with my own wife about I want my kids to have the motivation to go out and do things on their own and get that intrinsic value from it. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because my idea is maybe great for, younger age, but they do need that transition. And that's, I think, where the balance is probably going to be the hardest, is finding how to transition that, even using tools like Web3.
I think one of the challenges in moving away from systems that, so I dropped into the chat. There are systems that already exist that are building kind of these token systems. One that we just put in place is called PBIS, which is oh my gosh, why am I drawing a blank? Positive behavioral incentive. And the idea is that kids, through their behavior, aligning to specific behaviors in the school, desired outcomes, they get points for those behaviors when they're demonstrated. But it creates a very interesting dynamic where teachers are levering distributing these points in a way that can be somewhat harmful to sort of the classroom culture. And then those students can then use those points and redeem them for certain things. I think one of the challenges that we see is structurally schools are designed to be systems that kids enter and they get processed because there are systems in place to ensure they meet certain outcomes at each step of the way. And I think those systems, those structures kind of bound us in terms of how a token could really be used, that like we see in DAOs, where it could be used as a tool for governance or decision making, for value attribution. And I think a lot of those limitations that we would see in a traditional school setting is because of just the structures that are in place. So I think to really see the launch of tokens and tokens really, have an impact in the school setting, we're really going to need to address kind of the infrastructure that really the schools are built around now. And so I think what's really important, and a way for us to really have some impact now, is to begin to serve as the liaisons between what's actually happening in the world of Web3, finding those promising practices and seeding them where we can in schools as they exist now, and then along the way building parallel systems if we can, that really hopefully will replace the current systems we have right now.
Yes, and I think it's also very important to have in mind at what stage of children's development are we introducing tokens and as a reward system, because when they're younger, they're more susceptible to have the validation driven from being intrinsically motivated, and then they create this inner belief that if I want to be, if my dad is going to be happy about me, I have to do this and that type of behavior, and it's dangerous to introduce that in education system as well. So I think it's really, like, for example, with teenagers, we can explore that in more in depth, because for them, one of the biggest thing about being a teen is to develop the identity of self, and to explore to different things, that who am I as a person, and giving them tokens as a reward system for them to have some autonomy and agency over their decisions, and inclusion in the curriculum development, I think would be very empowering for them in the college years and later in life. And since we have a couple of more minutes to end, I would like to end with the questions regarding about the gradings and diplomas and whether or not they should be on blockchain. So could you please share a little bit more about that? Mike and Rudy are working a lot on crypto credentials and diplomas. So
I feel like we haven't heard from Ruben in a while, so I'd love to hear from him.
Ruben is still here. I'm sorry.
I did drop off for a minute.
Okay.
Some
Sorry.
network
Please.
issues, yeah, but I'm back, so I apologize. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting, and in a lot of ways, the idea of blockchain as really just this immutable ledger that tracks things like finances or things like credentials, right? I mean, that's kind of where it shines, and there are a lot of projects that are really that are leaning into this and saying maybe we should be putting credentials on blockchain. I think the big value to that, though, it has a lot of parallels to the financial system, right? We think about something like Bitcoin, and the big conversation and argument that I have with people is they say, well, we have PayPal, we have money transfers. Why do we need something like Bitcoin? And the answer is because you have this. It's a decentralized way of recording that you own something, and that's helpful if you're fleeing a dictator, right? You can keep your life savings, some wealth at least, some value in your head and access it via something like a seed phrase. And I think this is maybe not valuable for me. I am I'm just a young adult living in the United States, and there's no real immediate risk that I'm going to get a tremendous education and then have to flee my country and start over. But for some people, that really matters. And the normalizing doing these things like putting credentials on an immutable ledger that can be accessed if you have to drop everything and run, might not help us on this call, but it could do a lot to help other people. So I like the idea. I think we need to think about how to do it safely, like anything else in blockchain. But it's one of the few things that I hear that I'm not immediately fundamentally kind of opposed to.
I think this is brings up a bit of the point that Vitalik made not too long ago about soulbound tokens, and basically having a living record of your data attached to your profile on the chain. And I think that this is something that leans heavily into that if we were to integrate it with stuff that has to do with you as a person, your certificates and everything, that something like soulbound tokens would come in handy. I don't 100% know if that's the answer though, because there is drawbacks to immutability with things like that, because in a professional sense, sometimes something needs to be deleted or changed. So there is more research I think needs to be done on that. But the idea that you can store your certificates even without a soulbound token on chain, like through Arweave or even on Ethereum itself, I think will be huge in the future because of the permanence aspect of it. Because there are things that need to be permanent and need to always be accessible, like, give you my content address to my online resume, something as simple as that. But I know it's there because it's on chain and I can give someone that address and they can see it. So I think for certificates, it'll be a huge segue into just helping people with the simple things of just having it all together in one place and always accessible on demand.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think it's actually a little bit of a chicken before the egg kind of thing. So like, yes, it would be awesome. And, there are a lot of universities and schools that are putting transcripts on chain. So, last month, the state of Maharashtra, which has half the population of the United States, put 100,000 transcripts on chain, right? And it really did simplify and make more efficient their transcript systems. But I think the question is, what are we putting on chain and for what reason? Like, aside from like, having decentralized identities and being able to own your transcript. And I think the bigger question is like, do we want to put grades on chain? Because what do grades really tell us today, right? If Sarah gets an A and I get a B, does that mean that Sarah is smarter than me at something, or does it mean that she's a better test taker, right? And so the question is like, can we put portfolios on chain, right? So if Sarah created a robot and I created, a biological system where I recreated like, an aquaponic system or whatever, and that project itself is put on chain, the journey, the reflections, the artifacts that I created are put on chain and not the grade itself, then people who are looking at that transcript or looking at that, on-chain credential can say, oh, well, Sarah and Vridi both got Bs, but Sarah actually is really good at robotics and Vridi's really good at aquaponics, right? And that has so much more value than like the A's and B's and C's and whatever. I mean, at this point, like those don't really have any value anyway. Like there are so many universities, especially Ivy Leagues, that are actually allowing students to not submit SAT scores, but submit portfolios instead to get into Stanford, to get into MIT. And the reason they're doing that is because they see the value of proficiency-based and competency-based education, and to see, what can you actually do rather than like, how good are you at studying? So like, if we're thinking about putting transcripts on chain, then sure, in order to get the infrastructure started, let's put whatever we have now. But like, this really begs the conversation of how do we restart the system? How do we rethink the system? How do we like make sure that we're actually putting things on chain that have value and that present the real reflection of what a kid can actually do versus what the kid can sort of like perform on a test?
just really quick, I know we're at almost at time here, but I saw a comment that was in the chat that Jonathan Reyes had said, and just to kind of build on what Vridi was saying, and there's a lot of things to be hashed out yet with regard to what goes on chain, but what doesn't. But I think what really excites me about the idea of having credentials being on chain is that in the same way that DAOs are creating a way where people can contribute to the organization, and the organization as a whole can recognize that value creation through the attribution of tokens or some other way of giving capital to the people who contribute. We go through our lives and we spend all of our lives learning everywhere we go, whether we're in our homes or watching YouTube and learning things, or doing service projects or with NGOs or community organizations. Learning is happening all throughout our lives. And I think what's really exciting is that through some different thinking on systems, like Vridi was saying, that we might be able to build systems that attribute learning to learners when it happens, not just through a grade in a school, because the four walls of the school doesn't mean, if you're outside of it, that the learning ends. And so I'm hopeful that we're able to create systems that allow organizations, whether they're NGOs or community organizations, schools included, and others, through internships and externships, that those things can be recorded in a way that becomes helpful to me as the learner who's gathering those skills and then using them to propel myself further in the career that I hope to pursue. So a lot to be decided yet, but I think there's a lot of potential here that exists for us to really give power, shift power, I should say, away from schools into the hands of the learner.
Well, on that note, I think we're at time. So I want to thank all of the panelists very much. This was certainly a very engaging panel. I feel like I learned a lot. I'm really grateful for it. So thank you very much to Johnny Ringo from DAO Academy, Mike and Vridi from Ed3 DAO, Ruben from DCI, MIT and Stanford, and Sarah from Be Humane DAO and CityDAO for hosting. Thanks, everybody. It was a great panel. And well, I'm not going to stop recording. We have a couple minutes, but we're going to go right into our final panel for what's really a roundtable for this CityDAO academic conference. We'll have one more discussion followed by we have two keynote concluding speakers. And that will be Ryan Foland and Professor Denon. So our final panel or roundtable is on, just as we just discussed, the future of K-12 education and how it affects kids and whether it's dangerous, and the use of incentives and what can be put on the blockchain, and all of these really fundamental lodestone discussions. Now we're going to turn our attention to sort of higher education, with maybe a focus, if it's possible, on CityDAO University. And I say that with a grain of salt. When I say CityDAO University, I don't mean to brand it as if this is something that CityDAO is trying to do exclusively or make some sort of name brand. I mean, what it is higher education, but the idea of creating some sort of university. And so I think all of our roundtable discussants or panelists are here. Let me introduce everybody. We have me, I'm David from CityDAO. We have Scott A., also from CityDAO. So I'll introduce everybody quickly, then I'll give everybody just a minute to please give us your background, say hello, whatever you'd like to say. We have Ioana. Yes, you're here. Clinomenic, or Spencer, you can choose from Lobby 3 and PubDAO. Missy from Sapien Nation, yes, hello. I believe we have, is it Tej? I might be saying that wrong.
Tasia, yeah, I don't think he's on yet.
Okay. We have Saul Thorin, who I don't think is on yet. And I believe that's it for this one. So let's go around and have some quick introductions. I'm Scott A.
everybody. Yeah, Scott A. So, I think the CityDAO University it's kind of been our real passion for a little while. Multiple kind of came from a simple spot that if CityDAO wants to build on physical land, and Web3 education is going to be so important in the future, we kind of have something to build upon it that we could offer an in real life experience along with Web3 education. So anyway, just really passionate about that, and I've learned so much. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, pass it on. Spencer, hello.
Sure. Also, I wanted to point out that that Salthorn is here, but video is turned off, just so we can give it to her as well. Anyway, yeah, I'm Spencer. You may know me as Clinomenic. I'm involved with Lobby 3 and PubDAO and JournoDAO. And what really interests me most about this space is the whole slew of primarily non-financial applications of this technology that has implications for pretty much any kind of social institution we can imagine. And I think we're still at like a frontier stage where a lot of the first moves haven't been made yet in terms of figuring out best practices. And I know a lot of the folks here are involved with the cutting edges of these conversations. So I'm looking forward to learning from you all.
Great. How about Ioana?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ayana. My background is in law and sustainability, and I'm a contributor to CityDAO, and I'm pleased to take part to this panel. And I think the Web3 and the future of education will be on-chain.
Great, thank you. How about Missy?
Hey everyone, I'm excited to hear that there's another sustainability person in the room. Maybe we'll have to connect afterwards to talk about that. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Sapien. Sapien, we're aspiring to create a network state, a republic of DAOs that's focused on collective action. If you're not familiar with network states, I would highly recommend reading Balaji's The Network State. He has his book for free, thenetworkstate.com. And we're really focused on just cross-collaborating with DAOs. And actually a lot of people on this panel, this roundtable, we've done roundtables in the past. So Scott and Clinomenic. So we'll have to have some more roundtables with some of the additional people here in the future. And then I'm joined here today with Tasia, also from Sapien. And I'll drop a link to our wiki down below if you're interested in learning more about us.
Tasia, you want to say a quick hello?
Yeah, hi guys. I'm Tasia. I'm the CTO over at Sapien. Yeah, I just wanted to participate in this because it's a topic pretty important to me. I was formerly a PhD student, so I've seen kind of the education side both as a student in academia, also at the college level, and also as an educator. So I have a lot of opinions on this, and I have a lot of things I'd like to see change about the education system. So I think, this is a great opportunity to talk about, discuss those, and see how we can move forward.
Thanks. And last but not least, Saul Thorin.
Yeah, hey everybody. Saul Thorin, Renee, and my background is in organizational psychology, economics. I was a scientist for a while doing applied R&D. And I work across Bankless DAO, doing a lot of DeFi education and onboarding, Lobby 3, working closely with Spencer on some of the policy and advocacy stuff. And then the DAO I'm a part of that I started is focused a lot on distributed research organizations, creating educational hubs. Essentially, we're operating sort of a global research network as a DAO right now, trying to formalize it into what could be a legitimate institute at some point. So excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to have everybody here. This is actually to close out this academic conference. This is just a tremendous panel of people, and it really is an honor just to be able to interact with everybody, since we're really all on the same page. And I don't really think we need to list all the things that frustrate us about modern academia. I think we're probably in agreement. The question is, I have two big questions. I'll just throw them out there at the beginning and see where this goes. Number one, I have met so many people at my time in Web3 and just over the last 2 days of this conference who are working on different aspects of Web3 education. And part of the fear is that does it get siloed, where you have a lot of different DAOs and a lot of different organizations, not that they're replicating work, but that they're all doing things separately. Is it possible to make a university? Is that possible? And I don't necessarily mean one big castle-like structure with ivy growing on the walls on 50 acres of land necessarily. It could be a network university, which is cool, but is it possible to make one? And then the other side of that, where do you see a university, if this is the direction all of us, and I think a lot of other people are going in, where do you see universities in 10 years? So those are kind of my two big questions. We can go around, we can discuss, but right now I'll just throw that out to the group.
I guess I'll start this off to kind of explain how I think it'll go. I think that you may not necessarily have this one monolithic university, but truly it will be decentralized in the sense that you'll have a lot of these specialty groups, and similar to how a lot of academics collaborate now, they'll be discussing with each other and maybe having joint research projects, etc. And then in that same vein, they may have joint educational initiatives as well. But I still think that you'll have these people that aren't necessarily super siloed, but they'll be doing their own thing. They'll be trying to find their own students, etc., and they'll try to be doing their own research, but still they need some mechanisms to collaborate with each other in order to accomplish whatever their goals are. And I think those will be highly specialized. And I think that's a good thing, because that's kind of how academia currently functions, and there's a reason for that, which is that you want a bunch of experts collaborating and finding the absolute depths of the subject, right, and really exploring the annals of it and advancing a field in a certain direction.
Yeah, if I could just jump in. I don't know exactly how to unfold, but I think it was Steve actually, Karam, who brought up the idea of unbundling and rebundling, which you just hear about all the time. I think we're going to see a rapid process. Like universities sell so many things, and even just from the very basics that most universities have teaching and research just sort of interconnected. And they don't necessarily should be interconnected. Obviously, there's some degree they should be, but just unbundling those two components, separating them out. And I think you're just going to see a lot of the different things, the social aspects, and all these things kind of get torn apart. And I don't think the blockchain is going to be, it's going to be kind of disruptive, to be honest. I think traditional education systems are going to be really prepared for it. But and as David, you mentioned, there's so many different aspects, but something I kind of think is, we've talked about verified credentials, and in some ways, no one likes to talk about grading. These grades mean so much, but the reality is so many people in the world don't have access to verified credentials. They don't have just the ability to say, I'm capable of this. Give me some standard, even if it's A or whatever. To give people access to that around the world and put that on the blockchain it's so powerful, and it will give so many people opportunities to get part of labor markets. And then you can, and that's just it, you can break down the price of that, just so fundamental, and then you can start building back up around that. People can put back in the social experiences and all that sort of things like that. But anyway, I don't know if that makes sense. I think we're going to see universities sort of getting torn apart and rebuilt in a better way, I think.
So building off of what Scott was just talking about in terms of verified credentials, what we're doing at Sapien is, of course, if you're building a digital nation, you have to have a passport. So we have an NFT passport, and different DAOs can issue soul-bound tokens, or what we're calling badges. So if you are credentialed in a certain area, or you complete a certain course within a DAO, you can be credentialed with a badge. And another way we're leveraging these badges is by giving each DAO a ambassador badge. So each DAO can pick an ambassador within their DAO. They get to decide who and how that happens, but to represent in a digital parliament. So truly creating a digital nation, and education is such an important part of that. So within this parliament, having different committees, whether it's DSI, it's media, and actually Scott here is one of the co-leaders of our media committee, and then also Clinimac is helping with our advocacy committee, and then there's the education committee. And so we were actually just talking about this week, what's a good next step after this conference, and it's coming together, creating this CityDAO university. It's an education committee where different people can come in, represent themselves via different DAOs, and decide how this is going to look in a decentralized environment. And soulbound tokens can be a part of that, but it's much more than that. So having a way for each one of us to connect on a weekly basis, a bi-weekly basis, something that we do at Sapien is setting the foundation for this parliament, is having roundtables every couple weeks at 11 a.m. Pacific time on Twitter Spaces. And then we're eventually going to transition over to our DAP, the Sapien Network, where we're going to have this digital parliament. But the whole point of it is this cross collaboration, so we can work together and not in silos. As you're mentioning, David, we don't want to do that. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And so many different people are doing incredible work in different areas. So that cross collaboration with this education committee could be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and to Missy's point, I think this gets directly at David's concern of people unknowingly trying to do the same thing or similar things, and if they were aware of each other's efforts, they may be willing to cooperate and kind of work together to not unknowingly compete on doing the same thing. And I think conferences like this and the DAO roundtables that Sapien hosts are like the antidote to that potential scenario where people are kind of unaware of the full landscape of their industry peers that are doing the same thing, especially if your peers in this space share that kind of open source ethos, which it seems like is the status quo for people involved with this.
So I definitely agree with what's been said. I think the original question was, where do you see the future of Web3 education in 10 years? So I'm going to take the question to a little bit different of an area, but I think you're going to see existing institutes will certainly start experimenting with blockchain. I don't think they're going to probably structure themselves as a DAO. I don't think 10 years is probably long enough to uproot the sort of institutional control that all those stakeholders have over schools. But I do think you'll probably see degrees go on chain and certain other credentialing using like badge systems. But I think what's more interesting to me is you'll probably see DAOs start to buy schools that are either failing or empty buildings or like not as profitable, or even just outright buying and building a school. So it'll be kind of like opposites, is like DAOs will start Web3 and procure physical sort of brick and mortars, and then the brick and mortars are going to spend the next years trying kind of like catching up on Web3, not necessarily in knowledge, but in adoption. Like to try to get something like Carnegie Mellon or like any university to become a DAO when they have like billion-dollar endowments, like that is going to be a very difficult one to sell to a like provost that's making like 400K a year and barely does anything. But I do think you're going to see a lot of technology adoption in schools, which is going to be cool. But getting an online degree, I think, will become the cool new thing, because I'd much rather have a degree from like the MIT DAO of the world, whatever that becomes, versus like the brick and mortar. But that's kind of where my thinking's at, is like, what does the future of education look like if DAOs can start essentially acquiring physical locations for education?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the point about certificates and on-chain credentials being adopted, and maybe in certain cases they'll be more centralized or decentralized. Maybe they can still just kind of reinforce existing profit models. I think that there'll be like some degree of both. And I'm personally really interested in how we can go about verifiably associating employment opportunities with the possession of a given on-chain credential. Like, how do we know if a person who has this on-chain credential got access to this employment opportunity that they might not or would not have gotten access to had they not possessed that token in their wallet? And then how that could maybe feed back into a kind of revenue model for like a decentralized kind of funding for this university, if there's some way to ethically and consensually go about tracking the opportunities enabled by the credentials that you get, that wouldn't have to pay for getting the credentials if there could be this other revenue model. But I don't know if that opens up pitfalls that are worse than the current ones.
Saying ethically and consensually adds an important layer to this, but I just wanted to throw it back to Ioana to see if you had an initial response to this before we move on.
Yeah, as the previous panel mentioned, we have to build on the collective consciousness of the value that you mentioned, that some students perceive value in a certain way. And nowadays, especially that the world is so mixed in all senses, good and bad. So we have to build on the real value. What's something that connects us? So I think Web3, it's a great platform to start, in the sense that it opens accessibility, it opens diversity. And nowadays, it's so difficult, even for the richest countries, it's so difficult to obtain a degree. And even if you obtain it, then you have the hiring process, and it's a circle. And related to the 10 years prospects, as the problems are increasing, both locally and globally and regionally, let's say, I think we need solutions. I mean, for example, climate issues, health issues, commerce issues, and how to merge in a non-political, or like, let's say, obliging someone to do in a certain way, how to do this. And I think thinking both locally and globally at the same time could be the solution, but this could start slowly. And we don't have to force the education or like the subjects. I think it has to be built on the needs of the students, of the persons who want to solve issues.
I mean, that's a really interesting point too, the idea of, are we forcing this? Is this organic, or are we together out here pushing something? Do we have an agenda? I mean, it's interesting to think about motives. I want to bring this back to kind of what Clinomenic was just saying also about the ethics of collecting information. And it goes back to something somebody said a little bit earlier, which had to do with, well, grades, what do grades really mean anymore? And then somebody had mentioned, be that as it may, I don't necessarily want all my grades on a soulbound token that anybody can see out there. A C means nothing, fine, I still don't want you to know I got a C. So this is a big topic, I feel like, in these last 2 days, which is my initial thoughts on CityDAO University is, well, it has to be accredited. That wasn't even, it's a no-brainer, right? We want to compete, and you need to get an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or something. But I feel like my own thoughts on this are starting to change. What's the importance of accreditation? As Clinomenic said, is there a way to tie the skills you've learned, like the skill market cap idea, to actual financial outcomes that you've achieved or opportunities you've gotten as a result of having those skills? what do we need to accredit in order to make this vision of higher ed Web 3 go forward?
So this is one of the ones I have a strong opinion on. And I think this is largely due to the fact that a lot of these like higher prestige legacy institutions have a stranglehold over like accreditation. And the basic example, right? If I say I have a Stanford CS degree, that will open me up, that will open the doors to a lot more opportunities than someone with a degree from even like a state school. And that's just kind of natural because of, you know, the Stanford name, right? And what's happened there. But that may not necessarily reflect the actual skill set of the people applying, right? And I think that's probably one of the biggest problems. And I actually think this lends credence to unbundling this whole thing and maybe doing away with accreditation of, you know, these large monolithic things, and maybe trying to put more accreditation into these individual skills themselves, right? So if we can actually tie these verified credentials or these soulbound tokens specifically to the skill sets and not have it be this this like big degree, for example, that you need, and then tie opportunities directly to that, I think that's a really important point of a new education system, and one that truly decentralizes, right? Because right now, you know, these legacy institutions do have a centralization of power in the degrees that they're able to put out. And obviously, you know, it becomes more competitive. And so this is a way to hedge against that and make it better for everyone. Yeah, I actually talked about this with Scott before this, so.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think it's so powerful. And I mean, we're just dreaming now, I guess, but you know, in the future, I feel like accreditation will mean anything. You know, it's if you could track what skill you have and how much return that is, people could just make the decision. And theoretically, an employer will just pay you to get that skill, because why wouldn't they? If it's proven how much it returns and the value of it, it solves everything. It doesn't have to be debt, it doesn't need loans. It just has to be better information. And it could be cheap. And the thing is too, you can learn whatever you want. It doesn't have to be returned. If you want to take a class in drawing clouds and there's no return to that, you can get a soulbound token of drawing clouds. But the point is, everyone just knows exactly what they're in it for, what their turn is, what the financial gain is. And if you know that, like I say, employers will pay you to do it, because I mean, it just makes sense. When you go to school, you increase your productivity. They do pay, and you pay back the loan. It's just it's not a good situation. That's all. You can just kind of bring it all forward and unbundle it and make it a lot more sense and get rid of the stranglehold that the prestigious Ivy League schools have, which is insane. I totally agree with Tasia.
And I think another aspect about the employment opportunities and the ethics is like if we're trying to figure out some open source way, like some data analytic way to value credentials, you know, maybe there are ways to observe which credentials yield which kind of employment opportunities, seeing as it's all happening on a public ledger. But like to David's point earlier, like it's similar to you not necessarily wanting all of your grades and all of your information public if it's associable with you. It's like, and maybe there are ways to have this useful information there, but still kind of keep your like legal identity severed from it. Maybe there's a zero knowledge way to do it. I mean, this is part of what Lobby 3 is helping fund, is a zero knowledge ID, so that there may be some interesting opportunities afforded by that, but it opens up all these ethical concerns of, if we want to establish best practices, we'll need to draw from data, which in principle is easier on this big permissionless, you know, distributed database, but what are the consequences for people's privacy?
I don't think there is a unique solution in establishing ethics. So even let's say that universities decide to become more Web3 friendly, I think they still have to engage, because it's in their advantage also. So as Saul, let me see, the person from Bankless, Saul, sorry.
Yeah, okay.
As you said that soon universities will be bought by persons who want to evolve the space. For example, you said that damaged universities or places where universities are needed, there have to be restructured because there's a need. So I think the ethics could start both at the large scale and at the small scale. And I'm not sure if someone is able to create ethics for everyone. So maybe awareness and responsibility and desire from everyone to create a better world and better education could start from this. And as related to credentials, same. I mean, I don't think that the universities should be the same, or the topics should be the same, because the world needs everything and for everyone. But maybe this could be an eye-opening task for the actual universities to convert to a realistic model of solving problems and of incentivizing, because in a way students could contribute more easily in the Web3 space than in the actual space, that it's either very localized, established to a certain jurisdiction, or even politically supported, which is not bad, but I think we should evolve the space.
Great. Well, we have about 4 minutes left, and this was the shortest of our panels, but I certainly appreciate everybody's thoughts on this. It's such a big issue at the end of the day, is kind of, we have all these ideas and, how do we put them back together now that we're deconstructing them and we're unbundling them? How do we put it back together in the idea that ultimately there are thoughts, just like CityDAO thinks about making a city, whatever that means, and we think about building a university. And so to put it back together, I guess a final question for everybody would just be the very important and very common question of expense. In the sense that as we build a Web3 university, is it possible to get a great quality education without the expense? Obviously, we could cut out provosts who earn $400,000 a year. We may have a decentralized network campus, so it doesn't require this huge area of land with people tending to it. Any thoughts on how we reduce or maybe even minimize the expense of higher education through Web3?
So I actually think the content is already out there to have a good higher education. Universities in general have put a lot of effort into making a lot of that info free. Things like MIT, OCW, edX, Coursera, they've pulled from all of these high prestige institutions and actually gotten the knowledge out, and you can access it for free because there's this ethos that education should be a freely available thing. I think the most important thing will be how those things are curated, because when the average person sees all this content out there, it's very overwhelming. And if they don't have a good path in order to figure out, this is the stuff I need to learn, this is the sequence of learning it, and then ultimately this is overall the high level thing I'll learn, it's not going to be tenable for people. But I think that's how they get a lot of value out of this.
Thanks. Anybody else have any closing thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just on the same lines, but I know in my presentation earlier, I had the Web3 is trust. I mean, I think it's hard to even understand, but sometimes what you pay for by far and away the most is the brand, the reputation, the trust, and that takes a long time to build up. And I mean, I really do think the tools are in Web3 to actually sort of organically have trust emerge much quicker because it's just sort of built into the code. If you can do that, I mean, that's most what you're paying for. I really, really, truly believe so. So that'd be super powerful, and I really think it could be. I don't want to put a price on it, but it can be a lot cheaper to get a great education.
All right. Well, just to close on the thought, I actually really love what you were saying, Amtasia. Am I pronouncing that right?
That's
The
fair.
idea that maybe you're not just paying for the brand, maybe you're paying for the guide. If there's this endless, vast landscape of free material out there that is beyond daunting, I mean, the average freshman who gets into a school, they don't know what they're supposed to take or how they're supposed to pick that. And having a good guide can absolutely make the difference. So, okay, well, thank you very much, everybody who is on today's panel about the future of Web3 education. That is the final panel we have for our first CityDAO academic conference. And we are now honored to have our two closing speakers. We have Ryan Foland, who I see is here. Hello, Ryan. And we have Professor Denon, Michael Denon, who I see is here as well. Now, I'm not sure which of you two would like to speak first. We have an hour. So kind of between you two, yes, it looks like Ryan would like to speak first. Okay, so I open it up to you. Thank you so much for coming. We're absolutely honored to have you both here.
Awesome. Well, could I either get co-host privileges or could you pin myself and Michael so that we're easy for everybody to see as a side by side?
Sure, I can do both of those things. I'll give you co-host privileges.
If you do that, then I can pin myself up here. I'm gonna spotlight. I'm gonna bring up the one and only Mr. Michael Denon. Okay, and if this is too up close for you, you can always hit the grid view and then you can back it off and you can see everybody. But we can see everybody unless you just hid your face, and that's right. Well, my name is Ryan Foland. I'm coming to you live 26 miles off the coast of Southern California, here off of Catalina Island. I will say I'm tapping into a bunch of satellites overhead for Elon Musk's Starlight. And I think it's interesting. I'm looking forward to a world where I can be on my sailboat wherever I am and tap into this type of community. I work at the University of California, Irvine, and you're looking at my boss's boss there to the side. He and I together really try to focus on student success in the undergraduate realm. And so we're excited to talk to you today. In particular, I'm the interim director of what we call the Entrepreneur Center. Now, if you're not familiar with UCI, University of California, Irvine, we are the mighty ant eaters, the most ferocious of all college mascots by far. And we take ant eater plus entrepreneur and it becomes entrepreneur. And so my job is to help those bright-eyed, bushy-tailed students who want to take on the world and help teach them how to fish. Because if we can teach them how to fish, they'll eat for a lifetime versus just telling them how to do it. And Michael Denon here, he is not only a professor of physics, he studies bubbles. He is the Dean of Undergraduate Education at UCI, and he is the Vice Provost of Teaching Learning. And you'll see him on the History Channel, on Ancient Aliens, and he can tell you why pyramids were formed correctly instead of upside down with lots of proof. Michael, say hi to everybody here.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. This is exciting. So I'm looking forward to it. Ryan and I have a fun little conversation. I will say, right at the beginning, I think, Ryan, I can speak for you in this. We're also willing to be interrupted at any point. I mean, we have time at the end for questions, but I don't believe, people need to wait for their questions at the end or anything like that. So
that's so Web 2 to just wait. So Web 2, you got to be up on the Web 3. You just jump in there.
I will try and pay attention to the chat. I have it open on my screen. Ryan will too, but also just, unmute and say hi, and what we, love to be interrupted. And we don't have really an agenda. Ryan and I have a flow, and we can flow in lots of different directions. So if there are no questions, we'll do our flow. If there are questions that take us in an interesting direction, we'll do that as well. I think that's safe to say, right, Ryan?
I like it. I'm going to take your word flow and I'm going to rearrange and add a couple letters and I'm going to turn it into foam. So we're actually going to kick this off talking about foam. So I want to have everybody think about the foam in their life, whether it's at the top of your beer or whether it's the shaving cream that you use to shave. And our first question for you is foam, shaving cream in particular. Is it a liquid or is it a solid? Mr. Denon is a physicist at the end of the day, and we're going to start off with a little bit of emergent theory here for you. And it all starts with a question about shaving cream. So in the chat, take your best guess. The statistics are in your favor. You have a 50% chance here, but I want you to think about it. Is shaving cream foam? As a foam, is it liquid or solid?
So we'll
think
see
about
what
it.
people do.
I see some people with beards, so maybe they're not shaving as often. Okay, so David votes for solid. Let's see, Scott's solid. We have Armand, who's expressing his thoughts along the way with a ... and then a solid.
Well, I like going out of the box, taking a different answer, more gas. If anyone feels brave, I like liquid-ish. Maybe put your reason in the chat, why you picked solid or liquid or gas. Or you can just unmute and tell us your reason.
Well, from my understanding of the foam, the gas subdivides the liquids into little bubbles.
Perfect. So you got big gas bubbles with little liquid walls, mostly gas. Good answer, Will. Anyone else?
I mean, I would imagine that most of the actual substance is the lipid bilayers, and I would imagine that constitutes a solid, but maybe there's
Okay.
something missing.
No, good guess. Good thinking. Eric, fills to fit the space in its environment. So that's why you're saying, I assume it's a liquid. Okay, good. Made that connection. That is certainly the definition of a liquid. Okay, I'm gonna start with Eric's answer and challenge it a little bit. When I spray shaving cream out of the bottle onto my hand, it does not fill the space. It holds its shape. So if I take a foam and I take the sort of third gradish definition, which is one of the best of liquid or solid, solids hold their shape, liquids take the shape of a container. Shaving cream holds its shape. But the other definition is liquids flow, solids don't. Thank goodness when I put the shaving cream on my face, it flows. So this was a mean trick question. The answer is clearly both. The shaving cream as a substance in its entirety is a solid or liquid depending on what you do to it. So it depends on whether you're trying to apply forces or other things. To Will's point, and to some, I forget who, Spencer, I think you mentioned the lipid bilayers. Molecularly, it has a very, very specific sort of, the molecules are in either gas phases. The lipid bilayers tend to be liquid, actually, the lipid bilayers, but there are foams where the lipid bilayers are solid, and that gives the foam more stability. So there's both going on there. So the reason Ryan and I started with this is it's the best example I know of really of emergent property right off the bat. If you are a strict sort of reductionist scientist and you believe that if I look at the smallest piece, I'll understand the bigger piece. If you go down inside and look at the molecules of a foam, you're going to say it's some form of fluid. They're either in a liquid state or a gas state, done. But when you look at the foam as a whole, it's a solid right out of the bat, and it can be turned into a liquid. And so that is the quintessential definition of an emergent property, is the behavior of the whole is more than the sum of the behavior of the parts. Something new happens. And what new in the foam is basically the bubbles get in each other's way. In a good way, like not in a negative way. It's the way the bubbles are interacting. And you don't want to think molecules. The relevant thing is bubbles. So we're going to figure out or discuss as we go through this, who are the bubbles, who's the molecules, and who's the foam. So keep that analogy in the back of your mind, because we're going to come back to it.
And not only is foam or shaving cream a good example of emergent properties, but it's the closest example in real life that Michael and I can come up with when it comes to a DAO. So we're here to share with you that you're all a combination of liquid, solid, and bubbles. And based on the structure of those bubbles, based on the size of those bubbles, based on the way that those bubbles interact, based on the forces upon those bubbles, that is what will create the shape and form, whether it's more liquid, whether it's more solid, whether it's somewhere in between. But what's interesting about the DAO bubbles that we're talking about today is that each and every person who's a part of the DAO is part of that bubble equation, is part of that bubble system, is part of that foam being smeared all over the place. So today we're going to talk about shaving cream and DAOs, but we're first going to step back in time, and we're going to talk about the history of higher education, because if we're looking at emergent theory, you can't look at today's environment without dissecting where it all started. So Michael, where did this whole higher education start from a historical standpoint?
Yeah, one of the things I love about talking about what we need to do differently at the university moving forward, you know, whether it's a full Web 3.0 university or even just a traditional brick and mortar university, we've got to change. And what I like about thinking about the university is reminding people that it didn't just emerge as it is now, sort of in one piece all by itself, right? It came out of, you know, something before. And when you think about it and you talk about centralized versus decentralized, and as I came in at the end, someone mentioned, you know, administrators, you know, by the way, I do think administrators paid high salary are a key part of universities now because I got my kids through college, but that's a side note. No, but in a serious way, the initial universities were highly decentralized, right? Go all the way back to Socrates. It was just Socrates and a few students hanging out and chatting in the forum, right? And as you move forward, right, you actually have people at some point, probably late Middle Ages, a little bit farther past that, the faculty and students were still pretty self-organized and kind of doing their own thing in a bit of a decentralized situation where there's a lot of back and flow between the students and what they wanted and the faculty. But what happened at some point is you started needing to certify that someone actually came from your university, because it became interesting enough to have a degree that it became interesting enough to forge, right? And so one of the interesting things in centralization in the university came out of the need to prevent forgery. So like the first registrars were all faculty because there was nobody else. There was faculty and students. That was it. And so, you know, the faculty looked around and said, okay, George, your job is to make sure, you know, our degrees are not forgeable. And when they go out, people believe they actually, you know, did what they did at our university. And, you know, Harry, your job is to check when we get people from another university that it's real credentials and so on. So when you think about, you know, Web 3.0, blockchains and everything that we're talking about in DAOs, it fascinates me that a lot of this all comes down to certifying, right? That's what drove centralization, is there was no other technology for certifying other than centralizing and creating a parallel structure to the teaching that did the certifying, right? And so that,
and real quick, I'll add in that as Ruben's comment about the signaling from a Stanford CS degree, we see a lot of that now. And if you look at the forgeries today, there are people in public office who've even been caught red-handed with a degree that they actually don't have. And so it's interesting to see how decentralized became centralized. And now we're looking at how to decentralize, but with the technology possibly to get that counterfeit piece of it out of there. Go on, sir.
No, and so I think that's the first piece I think we wanted to set up, Ryan and I, right, is when we talk about decentralized versus centralized, we recognize that the university actually is evolving really in response to the pressures around it, right? And so one of the things that interests me as we move forward is how do we intentionally change the university versus just reactively change the university, right? And so that is why I started with the foam analogy, right? Is a lot of what happens in a foam when you're trying to design it as a physicist is you want to intentionally get certain properties. Now that you've actually studied the foam to see what are the sort of natural emergent properties just from evolution. So it's that back and forth between knowing how you got here, what were the pressures from society that made the university the way it is, so you can take what was necessary out of that and recreate it in a new way. And that was what was cool. I'm glad I jumped on early and caught the end of that little discussion, because I think what people were starting to get at are, what are the features of a university, not just the surface ones, what are the actual practical ones, the functions that need to be reproduced for it to still have value, but maybe not as much cost.
So let's transition into why higher education exists, right? We're still digging for this final, this original origin thread. And at the end of the day, we think that there's one reason today why there is higher education. And before we say what it is, we want to know what your guess is. So what do you think, whether it's centralized, decentralized, part of your CityDAO, part of a community college, part of a regular college, part of a Stanford, what is the reason for higher education? Drop it in the chat. I want to see where his head is at.
So again, independent of the style of university, I mean, what you're talking about, a decentralized university still must have a goal. There's a reason you're doing something. So,
okay, so Spencer says class differentiation. Yeah. Okay, we got sandbox for the real world skills. Got tool sets to hopefully adult well. Hopefully. What else? Why did you go to college? Or why didn't you? Specialization, spread hopefully good ideas. I like all the hopefulness. This is a very hopeful DAO here. I can tell. I might have to put on my hopeful hat just for us all here, just to inspire us.
Parents wanted me to. Okay.
Okay.
Hey, if you don't mind, do you know why your parents wanted you to? You know, to go back a reason. Get a good job. Okay.
Ding, 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 ding. We have our winner, ladies and gentlemen. Congratulations.
Doctor? Yeah. If you look at the history of the university, it really is fundamentally about getting a job. Now, there's a lot of other stuff we've layered and added onto it. But if you look at the original Greek liberal arts curriculum, right, in Socrates' time and others, the subjects that were picked so you would be basically a politician, a functioning citizen who could run the government of Athens, right, or wherever you were. And that continued through, like the liberal arts were defined as the arts you needed to do these high-level professions, which again was one of, you know, the first points, you know, a little bit of class differentiation. It was about having the jobs of doctor, lawyer, government worker. You know, there's a really interesting story. Galileo is one of my most favorite historical figures for many reasons. The best of which is his parents wanted him to be a doctor, Jonathan. That's why he was sent to school. He discovered he wanted to be a mathematician, which was a very, very low thing at the time. Mathematicians were not valued at all. It was a brand new idea, and he went onto it. Now, what we've done, Jefferson, is we've taken the original idea of the liberal arts curriculum, which was what got you a job, and have really appropriately in many ways repackaged it as the type of education that you need if you want to be able to be a proactive citizen, defend freedom, expand your views, understand and appreciate new ideas. So even the idea of a liberal arts education has evolved over time as we've had different goals around it. And it makes sense. If you want to be sort of a free participating person in society, you can draw a straight line between that and being the person in Greek society who was participating in democracy and had a liberal arts education, because the you know, everyone got to vote, where everyone was, you know, the select men who were allowed to vote and run the government. So this idea of being a free person is also connected with it, but there is this very, very strong thread of having a job. So that's, I think we have to keep that in the back of our mind. We don't need to maintain that as the goal, right? The goal of a university education could be purely to educate people and challenge them to have new ideas, and it be sort of a ancillary benefit that there's certain jobs they're good at. But we want to keep in mind kind of what the system was through most of history and decide consciously what do we want it to be going forward.
And if we take the derivative, the rate over change of what it means to get a job, it typically means that there's somebody who knows a lot more about something specialized to then teach to individuals who don't know as much.
Right.
And so if we look at education, or if part of this was to be somebody participating in society at a job level where they can sustain themselves, they're looking for that information and that transfer of knowledge. So professors know the information and they share it with students who want to learn. So Michael is coming from an interesting perspective because he is a professor. He is the person who's leading the charge.
Fuck, I want you to fuck me in the ass.
Okay, let's get Jose out of here. Let's remove him. I appreciate the comment, buddy, but I'm already taken. Thank you. So Michael, this transfer of power, really, this transfer of information, how core do you see that from the very beginning to now to where we're going to be? Because that seems to be the rising bubbles. So it's not maybe as much of a job, but we're living in this new world.
So one of the things when Ryan and I were talking, which I think is an interesting image, and I'll go back to a comment, Will, you made, right? The foam, most of the bubbles, it's the gas bubbles, and then there's the liquid walls, which are smaller and there's less of them. So to me, there's this really interesting image of, we think traditionally of the professor as the one in the front controlling the classroom with all the information, and then connected to that are the students sitting in the classroom, doing kind of the listening and receiving the information, right? If you think of a foam, right, you've got the liquid walls interconnected all throughout, you've got the gas bubbles all throughout, everybody interacting with each other. I kind of think of the faculty and the students as this interacting system. The fact they're kind of the liquid walls and the students are the gas bubbles, there's more students than there are faculty. They're interacting in these interesting ways of back and forth. It is true that we as faculty have areas of more expertise, but also students are bringing fresh ideas and new viewpoints and new ways to look at it. So it's a constant exchange back and forth. And again, in the foam, the gas bubbles, the actual gas in the bubbles are moving around between all the different gas bubbles, passing through the liquid walls, doing interesting interactions, jumping from bubble to bubble. I find it a very dynamic and very exciting sort of system. And it changes the sort of the equation a little bit from expert imparting knowledge. Again, someone mentioned it as I was coming on. So much of the knowledge is now out there. Now, at a research university, we are constantly creating new knowledge, always pushing the boundaries. So it's all only getting added to. The knowledge is out there, but it's the organization, the connections, the structures that are sometimes hard to see when you're just stuck in one little bubble bouncing around, diffusing as a gas. You don't know where all the other bubbles are. And the faculty around you kind of give that structure to pass from one bubble to another and to go back and forth. So I know I'm pushing the analogy, but I love making anything a foam.
So speaking of foam, when you're inside this foam, you don't really understand, and there's some mystery behind it. We do want to really dig into the real challenges or issues that we see with measuring success in higher education. But before that, I want to ask Michael to share a little peek under the foam hood to understand how students are actually admitted to UCI. Because when we understand that as a component, it's important to look at the full circle. If we're just talking about higher education being purely for a job, there's information transfer, or maybe started decentralized, became centralized. And even if we're in the route to become decentralized again, the concept from an inside perspective of how we choose these 30,000 students, I think is important as we take the next step to start to unpeel the onion. So Michael, how do students get approved or get into UCI?
Yeah, and I think this is the interesting question. And this is another side where a Web 3.0 has to think through and what it means and the impact. And one thing the internet can do is scale. Okay, at a brick and mortar university, we're kind of stuck at 30,000 students for two reasons. One is physical space. So that's changing a little bit. We have more classes online. We have more classes that are hybrid. UCI is kind of blessed. We have enough space. We could build more buildings. We could grow. But really 40, 50,000 would be our biggest. But we're at 30. So we limit the number of students. That's one thing. Two, it's also limited by our faculty because, like I said, there's a curation of the information. There's a connecting students to the information. One faculty member can only interact with so many students. So in a model of human interaction being the curation and the sort of guiding and the challenging, you're limited there. So how do you pick 30,000 students when, you know, let's take it by class. That turns out to be roughly 7,000 a class, a little bit more. And we get 140,000 applicants for 7,000 spots. This is where access to universities is one of the biggest challenges that we face right now. So the myth out there is that we admit individuals, that we take the 140,000 students, we rank them, you know, 1 to 140,000, and we take the best 7,000. That way, first of all, it's not a well-defined problem. It's ill-defined. There's no such thing as best. What we take is the students and we cluster them into basically, you would probably be successful at UCI, you probably wouldn't be for various factors. And there's about 15 parameters that get evaluated in the actual application process. It really isn't just SAT and GPA. They actually get rated, scored. They get scored on a 1 to 5. 1 and 2s kind of get in or have the option of getting in. 3, 4s, and 5s don't. Now you've got your pool down to maybe, I don't know, 50,000 students for 7,000 spots. And what we actually admit is a class. And every university does this. UCI is not alone, even the smaller liberal arts ones. We take all the students we think are eligible, and now we model them. And we have an algorithm, and we have a lot to, again, there's about 10 to 12 parameters, because fundamentally, you don't want 7,000 students who all play the oboe. You need a symphony that has oboe, violin, trumpet, you know, at the
Would you say
level.
that you don't want students that are the same size bubbles?
You don't want students that are the same size bubbles, keeping with our analogy, right? You know, you need math majors and English majors. You need, you know, all sorts of dimensions to make a class. So we actually admit a class. So the number one advice that I give high school students is make sure you don't have one single school you want to go to, because probability is against you. No matter how great you are and brilliant you are, everybody's running an algorithm. And if you're not the one picked in that algorithm, you won't get in. You want 3 or 4 or 5 schools that you really like, you think you'll be good at. Now probability is in your favor. The algorithm will get you into one of those. So when we think about universities, it hasn't reached sort of the average person's realization that we're not admitting individuals. You're not competing for a spot. We're admitting a class that's sort of optimized for a particular set of bubbles that we need in that class. So how that then maps over to when you decentralize and go totally Web3, not clear, but it's an important, I think, feature for people to keep in mind as they talk about the different types of universities.
Yeah, well, I think in a decentralized world, all 160,000 students just get access if that's where they want to go. And maybe it's not just UCI, maybe it's a series of different places that play to them. So let's transition to talk about the real issues that we see on campus in higher education. And we're not here to present the solutions. We're here to sort of spark the conversation around what blockchain, NFTs, DAOs, cryptography can do to help fill those gaps. So I want to ask everybody, what do you think the biggest issues are with higher education? We have 4 that we're going to talk about, 2 that we've already discussed, which are low-hanging fruit. But if you could get on your pedestal and talk with Socrates about what you have issues with the current system, what do you think that would be? It's too expensive. There's one. Just trying to feed the chat here.
Or, you know, affordability.
Good job, Will. There you go. Affordability.
Maybe I'll focus it a little bit, feeling like it just cog in the machine accessibility. What do you think is a problem for those who are the consumers of the university? Meaning, I am an employer, I'm someone outside, you know, I'm looking to take students out of the university. Right?
You're the other side of the equation of the job. If the goal is to get a job for the employers that we're preparing them for, what are the challenges that come with actually deciding? We just talked about students getting into the university. Now, when those university students transition to the real world, there are some real fundamental cracks that we're seeing that we can reverse engineer. See, variance of quality, do they actually have the skill set? Yes. Unsure what the students know with this degree. I like it. Yeah, the way they're taught. How does reading a bunch of books help get the job? Okay, so we're definitely on to something here. We're going to start off with one of the biggest fissures in that transition, and that is a 3-letter acronym called the GPA. If you are an employer or if you are a student, you understand that it's a numerical representation of your whole education. And there are some real flaws with that. So who better to tell you what those flaws are from the university side than Mr. Michael Denon? And from the employer side, I think you'll see where the disconnect is. So Michael, what's wrong with the GPA? We've been doing it forever.
Yeah. So again, a little historical context. It's an information transfer problem. Back before the middle of the 1800s, it was real simple. Nobody had grades, nobody had GPA. You were at the university for 4 years. And at the end, you took a big test. And if you did well enough, they said, yeah, you got a degree, and they sent you out. And you either learned stuff in 4 years or you didn't, right? But then suddenly we had the land grant universities, we had an explosion in universities, and people had to kind of share information efficiently, and we didn't have computers. So they invented letter grades and GPA. And what you realize if you think about this from an information problem and a data compression problem, grades are probably the most lossy data compression system you could imagine, right? So take just a class, and we're in the quarter system, so it's a 10-week class. I'm trying to teach someone physics. Will has experienced this, right? You take the physics class, right? And now if you get an A, you probably did everything in the class. If you get an F, you probably did nothing in the class.
What did Will do? We want to know. How did Will do? That's really the question.
We will not reveal that information. But you take everything in between, and I will argue it's pretty much useless for the following reason, right? Which is, if you're taking my class, you could get a B by doing everything not quite right. Like you could learn nothing completely and still get a B because we average things. You could learn 2 things awesome and 3 things really badly and still get a B. Okay. So to someone's point, you have no idea when you look at the grades in my class what someone actually learned, really. Then you take those grades that have already lost a lot of information and you average them together. And the one thing I always sort of say to people, okay, which would you rather hire? You know, the student who came in, took a set of courses, mostly in stuff they already knew in high school, they were pretty good at, and they got A's all through college. So you look at it, they have a 4.0 GPA. Or the student who comes in who, you know, came from an area where maybe their high school didn't have AP classes, it was underfunded, not very good. Their first year in college, they're getting C's, maybe some D's, they're figuring it all out. But by the time they're a senior, they've mastered everything, they've learned it all, they're getting A's, but their GPA is 2.8. Are you going to hire the 4.0 student or the 2.8 student, where the one never challenged themselves and you don't know when they're going to fall apart or if they can handle stress or difficulties, or the one who handled a lot of stress, difficulties, and then managed to move, you know, through things? A lot depends on the role, as Will said. A lot depends on what do you really know about that 4.0 student, or do they really just have all the skills you need and you're okay, or could they fall apart? So what I would love to do is figure out, like, one of my main goals for the next few years, whatever it is, you know, as a vice provost, for me, one of the biggest questions is, how do we actually communicate between each other what we know and what we've learned? Whether it's in a decentralized university or a centralized university, what can I show to people that demonstrates what I know? And there's a whole nother aspect, Ryan. I don't know if you want to touch on the whole hands-on and research side of what's going on and what we do in, say, the Entrepreneur Center.
Yeah, and so if we look at a research university, it's very much, as I think I saw in the chat, you read a whole bunch, you research, it's very theoretical. And that theory is based on the history of theory, the theorems prior to, which can be outdated in a very quick way now that we're looking at new technology and, you know, new ways. So that The world is actually not flat, if you guys didn't figure that out or not, right? It's just, there are new things to happen. And so let's look at entrepreneurship as an example of something that increases the value from a learning perspective when it's hands-on, right? It's one thing to read about startups. It's one thing to read about funding. It's one thing to theorize and do projects and evaluate what happened and what didn't. But until you're that person that is building the minimum viable product, when you're the person that's building the team, dealing with team dynamics, when you're the person that is trying to raise money from your family and friends, when you're the person that's up on stage pitching, these are all the skills that actually help you learn how to fish. And if you give a man or woman or person a fish they eat for a day, and if you teach them how to fish, they can fish and eat for a lifetime. And so entrepreneurship is one thing in particular where we see the more hands-on, the more skills that they're able to attain, the more they can transition, whether it's to their own startup or to something that might be more of an entrepreneurship role. Now, I believe there are statistics that show that over 50% of graduating seniors don't feel that they have the actual skills needed to enter the workforce. And if you look at that from the employer side, now they end up taking the responsibility, not of teaching them fundamental principles of theory of relativity, but they're actually teaching them the software and they're teaching them how to do things the way that they do them. And so this really creates this new dynamic model. Is the university becoming outdated if they're just research-based? Flip to like a polytechnic where everything is very organized and it's up to date on research sort of basis, and it's a whole different transition. And I think that what we've come to is how much is the student responsible for their experience. Historically, you apply to a college because you have the faith that Stanford is going to give you that social signaling. And as a freshman, you're putting on your freshman 15, you're drinking beers, you're hanging out, you're discovering the other sexes. You're just like, you're in this world. But at the end of the day, by the time that you were a senior, you supposedly have learned all this stuff. You've come through your rite of passages. But my mom always told me, especially when I was looking to figure out where I was going to go, and this applies to more than just college. She always says, Ryan, you're going to get out of it what you put into it. So it doesn't matter where you go to college. And I think that's the key part we have to remember here about the application and the skills. Because if you're passive in class and you can pass the grades, then it doesn't mean that you have that confidence or that resilience or the ability to actually fail in real life and then get up and keep on going. So if we're looking at enabling this new Web3 university model, how do we encourage the students to take that participatory role? Does everybody know about office hours? Yes, right? Office hours, you show up. Michael, how often do students actually show up for office hours?
Not often. And there's two great things about this that are kind of funny. One is I still haven't done it. I've always felt if I just charge for office hours, I'd get more students to come because people go to things that have a cost. And then I could have like a free self-attesting waiver. Like you get, if you can't afford it, you just self-attest that, you can't afford it and I'll waive the fee. So it's real easy to waive the fee. So it's interesting, Scott. I like the post. They only show up to complain about grades. I'm very mean. I have very clear policies that I only regrade things with written requests. Part of it is because I'm a wimp. So if you come into me in person and complain, I'm probably just going to give you the grade you want. And so to prevent that failure of my own self-control, I require written documents. It minimizes the number. I also will point out that I will regrade the whole thing. And your grade can go up and down. That also tends to minimize complaints. But the other thing we've learned is with like UCI, we're very proud that half our students are the first in their family to go to school. And we were surveying students and we found a really interesting thing. There's this whole thing called the hidden curriculum. It's real. We asked students, why weren't you going to office hours? And they're like, well, isn't office hours when the faculty members like doing their work, so you're not supposed to bug them? It's their office hours. It's when they're working. So we are starting a movement to call them student hours so that students know it's the hours where the student can come and talk to you. I always called them problem solving sessions and particularly if I'm going to stereotype here, so I apologize to all pre-meds in the world, but I often were teaching pre-meds physics. And if you're teaching pre-meds and you call it a problem solving session, you get good attendance. So to Ryan's question, I got really good attendance at my problem solving session, really bad attendance at my office hours.
And the takeaway here is that you can have a system, but if students aren't the ones that are engaging to get the information, then really where's the power of that whole institution? I will say, every single class that I had, I was after the first class, when the office hours or problem solving hours were stated, I would show up to that office hours every time, especially the first time, with the book in hand, and I'd sit out in front like 15, 20 minutes early, and they'd walk up and be like, "What are you doing here?" I'm like, "It's your office hours. I'm here to talk." And they would just be just absolutely shocked. But that is what started the relationship. And then I kept coming back and I kept coming back. And that's why I got out of my education what I put into it. And I think this is a huge part of this challenge, because you can create a system that's decentralized. That's great. But if you don't have somebody pulling the students across the finish line, are they really going to get that, the real value from it that they want? So to sort of wrap up this concept of the challenges and the issues, a GPA is not an indication of how well you can do at a job. Grades don't reflect where you do well or not well, because maybe you went on the biocide track and you got some bad grades, but then you decided not to be a biocide. Why is that still held against you? We touched on the access issue, and we finally talked here about the research versus hands-on skills. And I want to now transition into what I think is the key to this next transition. And this is something called active learning. So just so we can read the room, how many people have or know what active learning is? Like put a yes or a no or a Y or an N. Active learning. Do you know what that is? What that means? Yes, no, 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 yes, no. Great, we're about 50-50. So if I were to say what is active learning, it's asking a question to get information to then gauge how we are going to present the information, all while listening to what the engagement is for further questions, so that the next time we get together, we have a better way of approaching that same question. Michael, that's my high level analogy.
And that's perfect.
Step us through, because now we know what the audience knows.
Yeah.
Now we're going to sort of gauge and then make it a nice fluid conversation. So active learning, Michael, break it down. And why is this the key to a step to a more decentralized, a more autonomous, a more Web3 university?
Yeah, and it pulls together a lot of ideas. And I'm going to point to, David, you brought up the concerns over asynchronous, getting someone across the finish line, bureaucratic, changing the culture, engagement. The old school model really is the professor determines everything up front about the class. We create the tests, the grades, the schedule, we give the lectures. To Ryan's point, learning was always active in the sense that as the faculty, we gave you all that, and then we expected you to go out, do what you were supposed to do, and come back and we would test you and we'd see if you learned it. So the active part all happened sort of disconnected from the classroom part. And you either did it or you didn't as a student. You either actively engaged or not. You had no choice. And what we realize sort of in academics and in life is, as David, you point out, not everybody actually knows what they need to do. Not everybody has developed the internal motivation. You sort of have to recognize K through 12, because unfortunately it's evolved to get people into college. It's kind of high school has evolved a very external motivated system, and a very system motivated by grades. So it's hit or miss whether you learn how to learn in K through 12. So that's a whole separate problem that I can't solve and it's too big. But what we've done at the university is realize, and it's still a work in progress. At UCI, I'm very proud of how many faculty do it, but it's still maybe 30% of the faculty are doing active learning. But the core is the classroom becomes a dynamic partnership between the faculty and the students, where yes, ahead of time, you have a loose structure still of assignments and exams and what you're planning to do, but you're willing to flex that and have a feedback system where you come into class, you have some maybe individual or group assignment. As students are doing it, maybe the TAs, maybe some undergrad assistants are walking around, you're hearing what the students are saying in real time. You get real-time feedback and you can give real-time feedback to the students. One of the things that's really exciting about this is, I would say probably at a 70 to 90% level, I know what's going to confuse students because I've just been doing this a long time, but it's not 100%. And quantum mechanics was a class I was teaching once, and I gave the students assignment. They were all getting stuck, and I'm walking around talking to students, and I realized that the thing that was getting them stuck was not something I'd ever thought of. That allowed me to stop. I can give a 5-minute lecture on the fly to get everybody sort of realigned, go back, work around, work with people again. And more importantly, the students who aren't used to a particular way of actively engaging with physics are now seeing this modeled. So when they're home alone, or when they're on the internet looking for information, or they're taking advantage of everything out there, I'm pretty confident they've learned how to engage with this material and learn it. So it is this entire sort of team, back and forth dynamic that I think is a key underlying component to answer David's question. As you went to a total decentralized Web 3.0, you'd have to figure out how to empower the people who don't know how to engage with all the free information, right? It doesn't have to be a centralized structure, but what are the elements of the system? What are the features that are going to lead to that sort of ability to see how things are done, how to connect, get feedback on whether you're engaging with material correctly or not? So it's a core design element.
And it's a move away from the centralized historical professor, because in that respect, the professor decides, this is what you need to learn. This is what I'm going to teach you. These are the assignments that you're going to do. I'm going to grade you based on the questions that I come up with, and then I'm going to tell you whether you're right or wrong, and then that's the case. But in this active learning model, the faculty initially actually works with TAs and other faculty to make sure that they're looking at the concepts from a more diverse perspective. Then the idea is to get real-time feedback, and these are from questions or from real-time surveys or group work, and there's actually engagement, and the faculty now is watching. Somebody who's like a coach who's watching on the side with the students that are actually interacting, and they're listening. So the faculty's active listening is very much like voting, like a DAO, where people are contributing together instead of this super centralized center of the spoke hub. And so it becomes more focused on group work, becomes more focused on feedback, becomes more focused on identifying issues that arise during the process, and then going back and fundamentally rechanging the initial questions that are brought up. And this is a cycle that is based in decentralization, which really puts the student learning at the front. And that is, I think, why it is taking on, I guess, the role at the university that it should be.
Yeah.
One of the newest, largest buildings at UCI, Michael Dennon was in charge of building. It was a 60 million plus build out for the Anteater Learning Pavilion, which is set up so the technology supports active learning. So I think we're seeing this shift, but at the end of the day, we are here as this collective to look at how the technologies that we're starting to play with can play into the future. And so we're going to do a little, yes, sir.
Quickly, I'll just add a comment to that. One way I think to frame the question also is, how do you take what is a hierarchy of power, the traditional classroom dynamic, and turn it into what I would call sort of a hierarchy of expertise? And I'm using the word hierarchy in two different, very, very different ways. One sort of a negative hierarchy, and one, maybe instead of a hierarchy of expertise, a network of expertise. That might be less triggering of a word, right? Because what Ryan mentioned is, when we do active learning, we have at least 4 layers in the classroom. There's the students, there's sort of undergrads who have already taken the class as learning assistants. There's grad students who have sort of completed a degree in the area and are the next level up, and there's the faculty. So you have a whole range of experience, right? And they're on a much more level footing as they interact back and forth, but you benefit from people, the faculty who have years of experience, while you're benefiting from the entirely new perspectives of the brand new students. And you have the connection, that network connection between all layers. So you have people who recently experienced the course. So they have a little more expertise, but they're also closer sort of to the new ideas. And then you have the grad students and you have the faculty. And so it's that network, which brings us back to a phone, which is fundamentally a network, right? And so it's sort of thinking of, you don't lose the value of expertise, but you minimize the sort of negative elements of hierarchy and power. And that's where the sort of decentralization to a network comes in.
And so let's point some questions to the technologies that Web3 presents to see how this could all play out. Now, NFTs are a core piece of this. Smart contracts are a core piece of this. The blockchain for it to be built on is a core piece of this. The proof of attendance protocol for sort of a gateway drug to get into NFTs to show that you're there. in having some discussions with Michael about this, I don't think educators need to fundamentally know actually how the NFTs work and understand actually how these things work. But from a conceptual standpoint, if we allow them to ask questions about these issues, we can probably answer them with how NFTs can do that. So to the questions of what NFTs could do to play a role in allowing students to own their own experiences. And not just own their own experiences, but have those experiences be verified or validated on the blockchain with University of California as that stamp of approval. Michael, how do you think we could address the GPA issue with some of your understanding of the technologies that we have in play?
Yeah. And actually, looking at the time, we'll do this piece real quickly, I think, Ryan, because we're basically wrapping up anyway, and we've made it clear why we're more of a bubble and a foam, because I do want to make sure people can ask questions.
Absolutely.
And this is actually, I mean, this is where I think a lot of your all questions and expertise can come in. And Ryan hit the main point of it. I said earlier, you look at the beginning of the university and most of the centralized structure, its role was authentication and removing forgery. The GPA is a shortcut for sort of symbolizing to people, yes, this is what they know, and we certified this is their actual GPA. 3.0 is basically finally figuring out how to do a portfolio for things that aren't just art, right? How do you, whether you're doing it at UCI or whether you're doing it in your own, Web 3.0 CityDAO University, it's really giving the world the confidence that whatever this set of experiences is, that the student is claiming is their own and is evidence that they can do X, Y, or Z is actually theirs, right? That is, I think, the ultimate value the university brings to things in many ways, or an ultimate value, one of the fee. And basically, now that I'm learning what a wallet is, and apparently it's not the leather thing in my pocket, cool.
Yes, you now have an excuse because he's going to get a CityDAO citizenship token, and so we're going to share with him how to get a wallet. So you all have literally entered him into Web3. So congratulations on your first wallet.
Yes, I do learn still slowly, but it happens. But that is, to me, I'll say one other quick thing, and then we can sort of wrap up and go to questions. When you think about kind of the university, it's one of the last places in your experience at life where you have to keep all the things you did wrong, right? Like if you pick the wrong major, you get bad grades, we put in your GPA. I don't know about you all, but nobody lists on their CV or resume that I can tell all the jobs they didn't get, right? Like when you write your resume, you don't go, oh, well, these 6 people didn't give me a job, I better put that on the resume. Like nobody, if you happen to leave a job that you really didn't like, let's not call it being fired. Let's just say you left a job you really didn't like. You don't necessarily have to put it on your resume. All they care about is, can you do the job I'm trying to hire you for? And you put on the resume the stuff relevant to convincing them you can do the job they're hiring you for. Now, hopefully you don't lie because, and fake being able to do something. Let's just face it. If you are faking it, they find you pretty quickly and they fire you again. So there's built-in, security there. But the university should be a place where after 4 years, a student has a good idea of what they're good at, what they want to do, and what evidence they have that they can give to an employer that they can do it. And if we can just certify, yes, that evidence is really stuff that the student did, that's a huge value we add as a university, whatever that university is, whether it's a standard UCI or a new Web 3.0 university. But stamping that this is yours and you did it, the employer can judge if it's good or not. I don't even have to give it a grade. All I have to do is confirm that that's the student's. And it's between the student and the employer, or the student and whoever, to decide if it has the value for that particular exchange. So
we're gonna
that's my short version, Ryan.
Yeah, that's it. No, this is great. We've got a couple of half-baked ideas in the pot, and the idea here is to, if you're going to approach educators, our suggestion would be, don't necessarily start with the technology, start with the problems, and then share with them how you can solve that through technology, because there is that informational gap. So let's finish where we started, and let's talk about foam, shaving cream, and bubbles. At the end of the day, higher education is centralized, right? And so this is analogous to a whole bunch of bubbles that are the same size, that has less movement and less flow. That's what we're seeing. So a higher education that is evolved into something that's more decentralized is analogous to of foam with different sized bubbles. And this allows for more movement and more flow. And at the end of the day, a DAO is similar to a collection of bubbles in a number of different ways, because when you have different sized bubbles and fluid transactions, it allows for more floating and more feedback and more fluidity. And that foam can actually turn into something that everybody is on the same page with. So with that, we'll close it down to all of your foam. There's no place like foam, as I saw in the quote. So understand that you are a bubble, you are liquid, you are solid, and how you interact as a DAO will be more valuable based on looking at how, as fluid, you can work together. So we'll open it up for some questions. We're ready here to sort of face what you have, but it's exciting to now officially be part of this community and to be part of that larger conversation about changing things.
So question time.
All right, Will had a fake question, but he was just scratching his jaw. Spencer's looking like he's leaning close. David W took some notes. Scott's just making sure that nobody is in here Zoom bombing anymore. All right, Mike's on. Mike's maybe got a question. Okay, Mike, come on up here. He's getting his audio ready.
Oh, okay. Hey, it sounds like you're going from a professor ecosystem to a learning ecosystem. And as you do that, is there going to be an end in sight? In other words, with a professor ecosystem, 4 years, you get your degree and a grade. With a learning ecosystem, where is the end, or is there an end? And are the universities thinking past that point also?
No, that's a great question, Mike. And I will say, you know, at UCI, with our continuing ed side, we're very much using words like the 60-year curriculum, which I think is too short because we're all living longer. I keep hoping as I get older. You know, we're trying to figure out how to make it an ongoing process, an ongoing connection. You know, I think there'll be a couple of things. You know, I always point out to people, you know, the invention of movies and then the invention of TV. Movies did not get rid of live plays, and TV did not get rid of movies, right? Decentralized, completely decentralized Web 3.0 universities will be designed for a particular goal. The brick and mortar UCI research university will shift slightly. Will probably always stay kind of a 4-year-ish thing with a continuing ed, but enough other differences to meet sort of different goals. And the Web 3.0 will live in parallel with that, meeting its goals, being a sort of equally valid form of education, but a different path through, serving different people. So I do see a space for sort of maybe one version without any clear end line, because in the Web 3.0 version, maybe you're coming in and out as you need to learn things, right? So maybe there's like a 2-year period where you're learning to be a more efficient learner, and you get sort of some sort of certification or blockchain or NFT after that you can share with, this is sort of my skill set. And then you just come back and in and out as things change and as your needs change, much easier than you come in and out of the research university. And so like one of the things we're gonna have to figure out, like with research universities, how do you actually do research in decentralized? That's a whole lot. I mean, we talked about education. That's easier to understand how to decentralize than research, because research has much more obvious costs up front to it in many ways. And costs often require and equipment and physical spaces. A lot of research happens in an actual, like to Ryan's point, hands-on moving stuff around. So there's a lot of different things in that. But I think the bottom line, Mike, is you're going to see both. You're going to see ones with an end and ones that don't have an end.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you, Mike. Anybody else? We've got time for one more. David looks like he's pondering. All right, Spencer, come on up.
Sure. As someone who isn't familiar with like business models of how educational institutions work, one thing that interests me is this model, and I think this, for all I know, this is already common practice, but the ability to like access or audit a course for free, but you have to pay for eligibility to get a certificate. Is that something that's already widely used, or is that viable for what we're talking about here?
It's very mixed in its use, Spencer. So it's not totally crazy. I think let me just quickly comment on the business model, because I mentioned most people don't really understand admissions, and most people really don't understand the costs either, and that's the challenge. And one of the interesting things, if you look at the university, it's really funny, and I don't say this just out of self-interest. It's actually an exercise I have students do in the K through 12 system, right? Administrators and administration of the university looks like a really high cost, because our salaries do tend to be the biggest numbers until you take the number of administrators and divide by the number of students. We actually turned out to be one of the lowest costs per students, just from the math of the ratio. The costs of the in-person university are actually all of the massive services we provide to students that society refuses to. So it's the healthcare infrastructure, because I'm going to be blunt, this gets political. The United States doesn't have a healthcare structure, so we give our students that. We have a fresh food hub. We have lots of students at UCI that have food insecurity. We have students, we have to provide housing, because housing is a problem, right? And then, so there's the basic human needs that we as a university tend to apply. And then because of the other structures, there's the competitive things. People feel like sports is why you should go to the university. People like, students like a nice rec center, students like all. So the social dimension is another big cost. If you actually look at it, and then for a research university, not all universities are research universities. Research is a big cost. The actual education cost is important, but probably not our biggest cost. So if your only goal is education and you don't need to worry about healthcare, housing, food, and social interactions, like a sports team, you suddenly see a significant reduction in the cost in the business model. So in the space of education, I will admit the biggest cost is the faculty. We are the biggest cost for the education, because unlike administrators, once you get down to faculty, the faculty to student ratio is small enough that as a faculty, my salary is the biggest impact on the student, the expense of having a student in a university. And that maps to K through 12, right? All education systems, that's kind of the breakdown of where the costs are. So when you start thinking about business models, those are the elements to be aware of.
Thank you, Spencer.
And that's coming from a physicist, so it's probably all wrong, because it was all business and economics.
All right. Well, I mean, this has been a lot of fun, everybody here. Michael, it's a pleasure to share the stage in the flow that we normally have. So
Yep.
That was fun.
I'm glad to see Ryan, it worked on Zoom. This is our first back and forth on Zoom. We're usually on a stage doing this.
Yeah, and I'm here on a boat in the middle of the ocean, and you're there at UCI, so so it works out great. Well, I just want to thank Will for connecting us, Scott for putting the time to reach out and make sure that we were able to come in here and deliver something hopefully of high value for everybody. But we're excited to become part of your community and see where we can add value. And if you need a guest professor, you know who to call. If you need to talk about entrepreneurship, let me know. We're all here to support each other, right? That we're just being bubbles together in this crazy world.
Yep. And I will say quickly, Ruben, one of the biggest things on my mind is how do we do any of this with equity, whether it's in our four-year university, whether it's with a Web 3.0, or whether it's a combination, right? Systems, unfortunately, unless you're intentional, tend to lead to inequity, right? And so you really, you have to, it's hard to remember that you have to design equity in. You can't just let a system evolve, because most systems evolve to something that's not equitable. That's just a non-equilibrium system general principle, unfortunately and sadly.
But it's a good point to remember as we look at making sure that when things become decentralized, they don't then exclude certain people, even from a technology standpoint, right? Something as simple as connecting us together and making sure that everybody has that ability to connect.
And I really appreciate this. Thank you all. It was a great conversation.
Thank you so much. It was
Thank you guys so
great
much.
pleasure.
Good
All
luck
right.
and looking
Thanks,
forward
everybody.
to more conversations.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you guys. See you later.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Will.
Bye.
Adios.
Bye.
Have a great weekend, everybody. Enjoy not working.
Great.
All right, everybody, that concludes the CityDAO Academic Conference. Thank you, everybody who's still here. Some people have jumped off, but that's it. And we will see you all at CityDAO University graduation.
Thank you, David.
Bye.
That's great.